A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Guerrero.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon tausend Schabbos hat es getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never
Rudy Gebru with Jewish History Soundbites. And this episode is just saw the news this week that the Pope died. So I thought maybe it's we'll talk about the popes and Jews throughout Jewish history. Usually not a great relationship, to say the least. Just thought it was an opportune time. We would probably have to get to this episode anyway at some point. I remember many years ago when I was in the Mir Yeshiva as a bacher in the Mir Yeshiva in the dormitory, I had a book. I couldn't find it over Shabbos. I was looking for it to see if I can read some excerpts from it. It was an excellent book. It was called The Popes Against the Jews, The Vatican's Role in the Rise of Modern Antisemitism. And the author was excellent researcher, David Kurtzer. And he's written many books on this topic. He's written, I don't know, at least 5 or 6 books that I know of. He's like the guy, the go-to guy for this topic, the popes and the Jews, at least in the modern era, if not, I don't know about 2,000 years ago popes, but at least in the last few hundred years. He's written quite, and I like his stuff. I've read a few books of his. He's really, really good. So that was an excellent book. And I remember thinking, I'm probably the only one in the Mir Yeshiva dorms history who has read such a history book in the dorms. But apparently it was popular because another couple of guys in the dormitory borrowed it from me, and I don't have it today. So it's somewhere. I guess it ended up being popular. So that's where I first got interested into the subject. But it's a very important topic, not only in modern Jewish history and modern anti-Semitism, but throughout the long, long history of about 2,000 years of the popes and the Jews, or the Vatican and the Jews. It always struck me, and this is one of the many things I liked about back in the day when I worked in Yad Vashem. So one of the things I did was a guide in the museum. And one of the many things I liked about their museum, I still like about their museum, is in the first gallery of the museum in Yad Vashem in Yerushalayim. So they have a exhibit on anti-Semitism, which is supposed to lead you into Nazi racial anti-Semitism. And to me, it was perfectly done. They really, they start with church anti-Semitism over 1,000 years ago, medieval church, religious, Christian anti-Semitism promulgated by the Pope and the Vatican and the churches and priests and Christianity across Christian Europe during the Middle Ages. And then it transitions into modern anti-Semitism with the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. And then the third stage of the anti-Semitism exhibit brings you to Nazi racial anti-Semitism of Hitler and the Nazi Party, leading to the implementation of Nazi, Nuremberg laws in the 1930s against German Jewry, which obviously leads later to the Holocaust. And the reason I thought it was so well done is because if you don't have the context of 1,000 years of anti-Semitism, then you can't just jump into the story of the Holocaust and the Nazis. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens it's the end of this long road, which starts with the church, which starts with the official Christian stance of European anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism for so long, which develops and changes and evolves over the centuries. So it's very important. The idea, which is, by the way, the Popes Against the Jews, the David Kurtzer's book, it also brings out that point, which, as far as I know, is denied by the Vatican until today, that Nazi anti-Semitism, since it's racial in nature, and obviously the Church does not believe in racial anti-Semitism, because if you get baptized, then you're automatically embraced by the Church and you have eternal salvation. So therefore, racial anti-Semitism is an antithesis to Church teaching. So, as far as I know, the Vatican believes till today that they have zero responsibility for the rise of modern anti-Semitism and Nazi racial anti-Semitism and therefore the Holocaust, because the Church religious anti-Semitism has nothing to do with racial anti-Semitism, which is obviously wrong historically, because things develop, things change and evolve, and the Church and Christianity has a direct responsibility in that regard. By the way, they also have the popes and the Pope Pius the 12th, who was the Pope during the Holocaust, has other responsibility for, but that's for a different time. That we'll talk about another time. During the Holocaust, I'm talking about in a much more broader sense, in the official Pope and Papal and Church stance on anti-Semitism and its relationship with the Jews over the centuries. So there's a few ways to examine it. There's the popes and the Jews of Rome itself, which is a fascinating story and a humiliating one until modern times. That changed in the 20th century. But until modern times, there was this fascinating relationship between the popes and the Roman Jewish community, which is an ancient Jewish community. It always struck me on my visits to Rome with groups that the Jews suffered from anti-Semitism, and specifically from Christian anti-Semitism throughout Europe and beyond, obviously, and beyond Europe as well. But in Rome, it was unique in that they were literally in the shadow of the Vatican. They were literally in the shadow of the power and the awesomeness of the Church and the rule of the Church. And the Roman Jewish community had sustained special humiliation by the church authorities. They were forced to go to church right outside the ghetto on Shabbos afternoon on occasion to hear these talks, these lectures, these speeches from priests about the truth of Christianity and why Jews are wrong, basically. And they had to be subservient to the Pope and do all kinds of things that were, was to humiliate them, to show how subservient they are to the Church. And the Roman Jewish community had that direct relationship with the popes throughout the years. So that's Rome itself with the popes. Then there's the popes with their more broader jurisdiction. For about 1,000 years, there was something called the Papal States, which meant that the Pope, besides for being the Catholic ruler, meaning the religious ruler, there was also a Christian belief or a Catholic belief rather, that the Pope should be a earthly governor, ruler, king, basically, of a territory, of a country. And that was the Papal States from, I believe, the 8th century, the mid-8th century, like the 700s. And it was definitely until the unification of Italy in 1870. So it was well over 1,000 years, about 1,100 years, that the popes were actually heads of state. They had an entire country. So there's the relationship with the Jews who are in the lands of the Pope, where he is the head of state. And the constitution, essentially, of the Papal States is church doctrine, which, even though the church had what to say in the Middle Ages in all over Europe, and church laws and Christian laws were very dominant in state laws throughout the Middle Ages, down until modern times, down to the rise of nationalism, down to the French Revolution, in all over Europe, but specifically in the Papal States, that was the only law was religious law, was Catholic law, and the Pope was the head of state, essentially. And then beyond the Papal States itself, there was the Holy Roman Empire, where the Pope had, he personally appointed the emperors, and and he crowned the emperors, and he had very strong say in the governance of the Holy Roman Empire, which is most of Central Europe, the German-speaking lands of Central Europe, and the Pope had what to say in the Kingdom of France and in many other countries throughout Europe. And therefore with the Jews of those countries as well, throughout the Middle Ages and almost down to modern times. So it's the Pope with the Holy Roman Jews of the Holy Roman Empire, the Jews popes with the Jews of Europe. And then there's the Pope's relationship with the Jewish religion. So there's with the Jewish people, and then there's the theological relationship that the popes and Catholicism in general had throughout the ages with the Jewish religion. So this is a really broad topic, and if you want to go really till modern times, which of course I do because that's what I like, so then we're talking about the Pope's role in the Holocaust, Pope Pius XII, and then the popes after that, the 3, 4, 5, 6, however many there were, and their relationship with the Jewish people in the post-Holocaust era, specifically with the State of Israel. So that's an interesting history as well. So there's a lot the topic is too broad, so I want to just focus on a few isolated topics as examples, and obviously I want to make this as a disclaimer. This is by no means to say that I'm covering the topic, and you may say, oh, how can you speak about the popes against the Jews and not mention this and not mention that? Well, I'm not mentioning this and that because I'm just bringing a few isolated topics as examples. So that's just a disclaimer at the outset. The general medieval attitude of popes towards Jews is fascinating because it's this almost a dialectical approach of, on one hand, the Jews are the only minority in Europe that does not face forced conversion to the Catholic Church. Not always. There were times that Jewish communities, many times, unfortunately, that Jewish communities throughout the Middle Ages, also down to modern times, were faced with forced conversion. And many times Jews were killed because they refused to convert to the Catholic Church. Crusades and pogroms and all kinds of things like that. But as an official policy, in general, the official papal policy towards Jews was, as opposed to all the other pagan tribes throughout Europe, right? So you had the Christianization of Europe in the Middle Ages, and all these pagan tribes and pagan kingdoms were forcibly converted with the spread of Christianity throughout Europe. And there's eventually, in the High Middle Ages, there's one minority left in the entire Europe, and that's Jews. No one else. Everyone else in Europe, until the Protestant Reformation, is Catholic. The entire European continent is Catholic, except where areas of the Ottoman Empire's incursion into southern Europe, so those are Muslim. But basically, most of continental or other Islamic empires, like in Spain, but most of Europe is Christian, and Christian means Catholic until the Protestant Reformation, except in Eastern Europe, there's the Orthodox Church, but that's also Christian, the Eastern churches. But basically, everything is, all of Central and Western Europe is under the realm of the Pope, of Catholicism, and there's only one minority in the entire Europe, and that's the Jews. So the Jews are spared, again, in a general sense. There's many instances where Jewish communities here and there were forcibly converted, or at least there was an attempt to forcibly convert them, and Jews were killed, al Kiddush Hashem, to not convert to the church. But as an overall policy of the popes towards the Jews, on one hand, they do not force them to convert, but on the other hand, there's this humiliation, there's this persecution, they're othered, they're the other of society, they're disgraced, they're limited, they're discriminated against, they are forced to live in certain areas, the Roman ghetto and the Italian ghettos, and of course later on in most of Western Europe, the Christian authorities, the non-Jewish authorities, force the Jews to live in certain areas. They limit what their occupation is allowed to be, and they face all kinds of discrimination and humiliation, degradation. They're forced to wear certain types of clothes. They're forced to, be labeled in these. Again, we know the Nazi yellow star. The Nazi yellow star comes from the medieval church laws. that Jews were forced under the Catholic Church to, in many places and many times throughout European history, to wear some sort of yellow badge. The yellow badge in the Middle Ages meant plague, meant the quarantine from like a pandemic. The quarantine, they used to paint yellow on the house which was quarantined when there was a epidemic. So like the Jews were diseased. Stay away from them. These are Jews. These are different. They don't believe in the truth. And that was an official policy of the popes. But on the other hand, no, we're not going to kill them. At least not all the time. Sometimes they did. But at least an official policy. There was not an official policy to always kill Jews. There was not an official policy to always convert them. They were allowed to practice their religion. There was a certain freedom of religion to a limited extent. So there's this very interesting approach. There's like this mixed relationship. And it's because the church and the popes recognize that the Jews are the bearers of the Old Testament. The Jews are the original Christians, right? They're pre-Christians. Yashka, Jesus, came from the Jewish community. He was an observant Jew during the second Beis HaMikdash. And this way, the idea was that they can't get rid of them entirely. They have to recognize that this is where they come from. So there's this very complicated and complex relationship. I found this fascinating tablet article by, what was his name? Very, very well written, Frederick Brantfin from 3 years ago, 2022. Also, half the article is him, half the article is the chief rabbi of Italy or Rome, Rabbi Riccardo Shmuel di Segni. I'm mispronouncing it. Excellent article, anyways, if you want to look it up, about the popes and the Jews. And what struck me is that he goes into the Middle Ages there, and he talks about a custom that I was not even aware of until I did some research on this, is that the Jews of Rome, specifically the Roman Jewish community, was required to present a Sefer Torah as a gift throughout the Middle Ages for like hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. Every single time there was an inauguration of a new pope, there was this bizarre ceremony where in the midst of these celebrations and this pomp and ceremony of the Vatican, of the Pope, and crowning the Pope and the new Pope and all that, the Jewish community of Rome was required to come and partake in these ceremonies and present the Pope with a Sefer Torah. And it was designed to humiliate the Jews. They used to do it in front of Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian's tomb. Hadrian is one, of course, who crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt and then banned the Jews from living in Yerushalayim and the entire Judea province. So this is a symbol of Jewish subjugation. And then later on, even better, they made it even better. They made the Jews present their Sefer Torah in front of the Arch of Titus in Rome, which of course is the symbol of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the second Beis HaMikdash. And then when they presented this Sefer Torah to the Pope, what did they say? So they bring here in the article an approximate translation, I guess from Latin or something, of what they said. They were supposed to say, "Holy Father, in the name of our synagogue, we Hebrew men implore that your holiness deign to confirm and approve the Mosaic law, which Almighty God gave to Moses, our shepherd, on Mount Sinai. As the other supreme pontiffs, your holiness's predecessors have confirmed and approved it." So they're saying this is the Old Testament, and the Old Testament in the original Hebrew, so it's even better than your Old Testament, which is just a translation into Latin or Greek or any other language. So the idea was that the Jews are saying, on one hand, we have something over you. We're the original ones. We're the ones who received the Torah. We have it in the original language. We have God's word. And then part of the ceremony was that the Pope rejected this gift. And this was the whole idea, that on one hand, the Pope has to recognize that the Jews are there, and they're the bearers of the Old Testament, the Word of God, and they're the originals, so to speak, but then he rejects it. And what does he say when they in his rejection? And again, this was said by every Pope, more or less. And he brings here two nuschois, two ways of different popes who said it. So I'm going to read you both because I think it's very insightful. The one pope said to them, or this was one version of what the popes said to the Jews in rejecting their gift of the Sefer Torah. God who you once knew, today you ignore. You are his people and you have become his enemy. When he is revealed, you block him from view, although you know how to recognize him. Now when he is present, you disdain him. The nations have recognized his coming, you avoid him. You have rejected he who came among his people and put to death he who shed his blood for you. This ignorance of the meaning of the scripture will lead you to perdition. Repent, if you wish, on the day of judgment to share the fate of the just, who the Lord welcomes in glory because of their merits. Another version said by other popes says like this: we praise and revere the holy law, for that it was given to your fathers by Almighty God through Moses. Your religious practices, however, and your worthless explanations of the law we condemn, for the Redeemer for whom you wait in vain has long since come. In other words, this bizarre ceremony the whole idea was to say, no, you Jews, you might have the original, but you rejected Jesus, Yashka, however you prefer to refer to him, and therefore you're no good, and your God rejects you, and we're the ones who have it now. And the whole point was a humiliation, but at the same time, not just humiliation, but also this, almost like the popes were forcing themselves to acknowledge the existence of the Jews and their being the original. So it's a very complex relationship, like I said before, that it's both at the same time, and the popes recognize this, and they orchestrated this whole ceremony. In other words, if they don't like the Jews and they think that they rejected Jesus, then just get rid of them. No, they don't get rid of them. It has to be both. It has to be we acknowledge their existence, and they're continuing practicing their religion, and they're continuing living in Rome as a Jewish community, and they're holding on to the Sefer Torah. But at the same time, we have to put them in their place, so to speak, and put them in the place that they're less than the church. So I thought that was a fascinating relationship that the Jews of Rome, and it's expressed through the Jews of Rome, but obviously this fuels onto the more broader relationship with the popes with the Jews around Europe. Now, if we focus a little bit more on the popes and the Jews of the Papal States and the Jews who lived in under the direct jurisdiction of the Pope, and let's go a little bit more to the modern era, from the 1600s, 1700s, 1500s even. So there's like I said, there's Catholic law. And the Pope sometimes, there's a couple of stories of the Pope ordering a burning of the Talmud, because Talmudic law is heresy and says things against the church, and the Talmud is not allowed to be printed in the Papal States for a long time, or it's heavy censorship on general in Jewish Sfarim, and there's this repression of Jewish life within the Papal States, and incredibly the Jews continue to live in the Papal States. Not a huge amount in the mid-1800s, which is towards the end of the Papal States, basically the end, 1870, the unification of Italy, the Kingdom of Italy. So that's the end of the Papal States. So in the mid-1800s, shortly before the Papal States come to an end, there's only about 15,000 Jews in the entire Papal States, including the Roman Jewish community, which is quite relatively large. So it means the rest of the Papal States is really small Jewish communities. Papal States are central Italy, right? Or it depends on the year, but large parts of central and northern Italy at different times. So there's these repressions. One of the most famous and most important stories that really gives an insight into the Pope's relationship with the Jews, which David Kurtzer, in his many great writings on this topic, devoted an entire book to this topic, and that's the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara from his family, his Jewish boy, 6-year-old boy. In 1858, the 6-year-old Jewish boy is kidnapped by the church, by the orders of the. The Pope didn't give the direct order, but later he almost like adopted the child as his own, meaning he, through his full personal influence. This is Pope Pius XII, who's I think the longest serving pope in history, in church history. So he's. So he's the Pope then. And what happens? What happens is this boy, his family lives in Bologna, in central north Italy, sort of. And it's within the jurisdiction of the Papal States, where, like we said, the Constitution is church law, Catholic law. That's the only law, the religious law that exists. And under church law, if there's something called an emergency baptism that anyone's allowed to do on a baby or a child that is sick and is dying, and the only way to save him, not only way to save him, but to promise salvation, to save his soul, his or her soul, so that this Jewish or any non-Catholic and really who's going to die. So at least their soul will be saved. So that conversion has validity, even without consent. And obviously, once the person, the individual involved, is Catholic, is considered Catholic because of this baptism, so they cannot be raised by non-Catholics. That's the law. So it turned out there was this rumor that spread around that when this Edgardo Mortara was a little baby, a couple of months old, 6 years earlier, he had been sick, and the non-Jewish, it was a teenage illiterate girl who was a Catholic girl who was hired by this middle-class Jewish family to be like, a housekeeper, to help with the kids and help with the upkeep of the house and cleaning and stuff like that, which was quite common in those areas at that time that Jews did. They hired a local, from one of the local villages, they hired someone to be their Catholic girl to be their housekeeper. So this girl saw this little Jewish child who was sick and dying, and she wanted to save his soul, and she gave this baptism. So no one had found out about it for 6 years. The kid was around 6 years old. 6 years later, it turned out that this happened, and obviously she was the only one who witnessed it, and there were some holes in her story. And but the Inquisition, right? You thought the Inquisition was only in Spain by the expulsion from Spain. So the Inquisition was wherever there was church law. So there was a Inquisition in the Papal States in the 1800s, mid-1800s. There was an office of the Inquisition, and the local Inquisition Catholic authorities, they decide to dispatch the police. The testimonies that we have say that the police were crying when they did this. They didn't want to, but they're just following orders. That's exactly what the police officers said, right? Predating the Nazi SS claim at Nuremberg by about a century. This is 1858. Their police are following orders because the police are sworn to the law of the Papal States. They live in the Papal States. The Pope law, the Inquisition law, is the only thing that matters. And the kid is brought to under the jurisdiction of the church, and eventually the Pope himself gets involved, and he takes him under his personal wing, and he personally raises him. So this Edgardo Mortara is personally raised by the Pope. He eventually became a priest. He eventually reconnected with his family, ironically, funnily enough, and he lived a long life. He passed away in Belgium in 1940. So at the beginning of World War II. So in any event, so this became a international sensational story. Now, this wasn't the first story of a kidnapping of the church against Jews, because this had happened before. There was many stories like this. The reason this became major news is because the world was changing, and the world got into this. This is the mid-19th century. There's a lot of attack on the church. There's a lot of attack on the Papal States. There's a lot of attack on the Pope's religious authority. This is the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. This is the rise of secularism. We just did a whole series on secularism, and I mentioned in that series about how the Christian Europe was secularizing during this time. It's nothing unique and special about the Jews. This is a general secularization during this time, and there's a lot of critique on church authority and papal authority, and here this was a perfect story. Liberals, Protestants, and others throughout the world, they get on this, and this is also the rise of the modern media, newspapers, and technology that carries stories. And this becomes an international story, headlines all over the world. The Pope and the Papal States are backward. They're medieval. They're stuck in the Middle Ages. They're doing church law, religious law that forces and kidnaps kids from their parents, and awful thing. And it becomes this huge sensational story. Now, the poor parents and the poor Jewish community, they just want their kid back. But and this is common, unfortunately, throughout history, is that the Jew, to a certain extent you see it today, but I don't like talking about current events, so I'm not going to elaborate. But the Jews become a fulcrum. The Jews become a barometer, almost, in a political discourse. In other words, your position on Jews, your position on anti-Semitism defines your place on the political spectrum. And this is exactly what happened in the 19th century. If you're pro-emancipation, pro-Jews, you're liberal, you're allowing, we're against anti-Semitism, we're against papal overreach and kidnapping this kid from their home. And what do you mean? Jews have equal rights, and Jews, how can you take it away from her parents and things like that? Then you're liberal, then you're Protestant, or then you're just anti-church, you're an atheist, you're this, you're that. Everyone had their bone to pick with the Pope at the time. And by the way, this Pope, until this time, was considered very good to the Jews. He changed his mind afterwards, but he originally allowed the Jews of the Roman ghetto to live in other parts of Rome, and he later reversed that law. He changed the law. The first time in like 1,000 years that Jews were not forced to hear lectures on Shabbos afternoon about the truth of the church. Again, Roman Jews, the Jews in the Roman ghetto. So he stopped that practice. So he was considered this liberal pope until this moment. But in 1858, that all changed. By the way, 1 year later, the city of Bologna and its environs became part of Italy. In other words, it was the shrinking Papal States at this time, which eventually disappeared a couple of years later in 1870. One of the things this did was the king, emperor, I don't know what he's called, of France at this time was Napoleon III, the nephew of the original Napoleon. And the French army protected the Papal States. In other words, the Pope didn't have an army. And the French, very Catholic country, they were the ones, the French garrison basically was in Rome, and they protected the Papal States. And the French supported the Pope and his continued leadership of the Papal States against the trend of the unification of Italy to become the Kingdom of Italy, which would destroy the Papal States. So the French were the only thing keeping the Pope in power, and because of this Edgardo Mortara kidnapping, Napoleon III turned against the Pope and turned against the continuation of the Papal States because it was just a horrifying story, just kidnapping this kid from his home. So this story of Edgardo Mortara not only became an international story, but it also led to the end of the Papal States. The Pope no longer he was only a religious leader, no longer a government leader. So that's a great story that really focuses on how the Pope's against the Jews, and again, this is all from David Kurtzer's books that talk about the topic, that down into the modern era, there's the rise of modern anti-Semitism. So get into one more topic, that the rise of modern anti-Semitism, which the Vatican, as far as I know, till today, denies that the church had a role in the rise of modern anti-Semitism, because the Vatican's position is medieval anti-Semitism we're responsible for, and unfortunately, that's a terrible thing that Christians have to be ashamed of, and the popes have to be ashamed of. I think they acknowledge that. They don't call it anti-Semitism, they call it anti-Judaism. And then they said, but no, that's only until the 19th century. 19th century, there's modern anti-Semitism. And that has nothing to do with the church, because that's social, that's political, that eventually is racial, which is an antithesis to church teaching, racial anti-Semitism. So that the church has no responsibility for. But the exact opposite is the case, because the popes, the Vatican, the Catholic Church was directly responsible for the rise of modern anti-Semitism, because it transitioned very seamlessly from religious anti-Semitism to modern anti-Semitism, which was nationalistic in nature, which was political in nature, which was social in nature, economic, because, first of all, the Pope and the Catholic Church position across Europe in the 19th century was anti-emancipation. not to give the Jews emancipation, not to integrate them into society. They fought emancipation tooth and nail. That's number one. Number two, when emancipation was given to the Jews of Europe against the protests of the Catholic Church, they promoted every single modern anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, which created modern anti-Semitism. The Jews are taking advantage of emancipation by taking over, and it's the Jews are in charge of the banks. By the way, in the Edgardo Mortara story, the official Pope position in Rome was the reason that the international media is all over this story, and the reason the international media is anti the Pope in this story is because the Jews control the media. Wow, sounds familiar. So that was exactly what they did. The Jews are, taking advantage of emancipation, and they're moving into Catholic society, and they're ruining Christian Europe, and they're taking over the business, and they're taking over the banks, and they're taking over the media, and they're ruining society and the social and religious mores of society and the ethics and morals of society. And that is the underpinnings of all modern anti-Semitism. So that all comes from the Pope, from the Vatican, and from the Catholic Church. So the rise of modern anti-Semitism, unlike what the Vatican would like to think, is actually historically proven to be in the responsibility of the Pope. Now, if we come down just the last couple of minutes of this podcast to discuss two popes of the 20th century and contrast two popes. There's many popes in the 20th century, but I want to contrast two. There's Pope Pius XII, who was the Pope during the Holocaust and his relationship with Nazi Germany, both in the years leading up to the Holocaust, three time periods. During the Holocaust, what he did or didn't do, what he knew and didn't know, what he could have done. Now they did, again, it's this dialectical approach. There were many convents, and again, the Pope supported this, that the Jews should be given refuge in convents and priests and nuns and should rescue Jews and hide them, especially Jews who converted, but even Jews who didn't convert. There was that aspect of it as well. On the other hand, there's a lot of evidence to support, and there's more and more evidence coming out because those files were finally declassified in recent years. So we're going to probably see quite a few books coming out in the coming years about Pope Pius XII's complicity in what was going on in the Holocaust, about what he knew and didn't know, what he could have done, what type of protests he could have had, what more could he have done, and all kinds of things like that. And then in the years following the Holocaust, because the Vatican was very much involved in helping SS officers escape to South America and things like that. It was called the Rat Line that went through the Vatican. That's on one side. On the other side, you had a fascinating story of Pope John Paul II. Now, so when we compare popes and their relationships with the Jews, it's a relative comparison, right? So no one's perfect. But relative to pretty much any other pope in history, Pope John Paul II did more to fix the papal relationship, or even the church's broader church relationship, Christianity's relationship with the Jews, probably more than all other popes combined. I mean, it was an incredible transformation. And again, he had his faults also. But I like to note that Pope John Paul II grew up in pre-war Poland, in Krakow, in pre-war Poland. And he's the only Polish pope in church history, as far as I know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think he's the only Polish pope in history. And he grows up in pre-war Poland, in a place like Krakow. Many of his classmates, his childhood friends, were Jewish. He used to play soccer. He was a big soccer guy, a big soccer fan, a big soccer player in his youth. So he used to play soccer with Jews and Jewish teams. So this is probably, as far as I know, again, the only pope in history whose personal background was growing up with Jews, who knew Jews as people and as communities up close, personal relationships, personal friendships. And that, I think, as far as my reading of history goes, that led to a lot of his understanding. Also the Holocaust. He saw the Holocaust up close, meaning he saw the destruction of Polish Jewry. He lived in Poland, even if he was back and forth from Rome and Poland, but he definitely he saw the destruction of Polish Jewry up close. So he saw the Holocaust take place, and that it had a big impact on him as well. And therefore, a lot of the church reforms under his watch. First of all, the acknowledgement of church anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, even though under his watch it was this negation of the church's responsibility for modern anti-Semitism, which I mentioned before, which again, like I said, he's not perfect, but the acknowledgement of early anti-Semitism becomes the first pope to visit a shul, Orthodox shul, the Roman Great Synagogue. He had a personal relationship and friendship with the chief rabbi of Rome, the Orthodox chief rabbi of Rome, Rabbi Leo Toff, who's the chief rabbi of Rome for over 50 years, also a fascinating personality. And he also becomes there was a sort of visit to Israel in the 1960s, but that was not an official visit. He becomes the first pope to officially make an official state visit to Israel. During that visit, he visits Yad Vashem. During that visit, he visits the Kaisel, and that was a very, very important statement to the world. He called the Jews the church's older brothers. He also, diplomatically recognized the state of Israel, which was also a big step. So there was all these kinds of things which came from the Vatican because of Pope John Paul II. So relatively to other popes in history, this was someone who came with a different voice and a different attitude. Now, there was a few popes since then, but that's already modern, contemporary history, so I'm not going to get involved with that. The last 2-3 popes since then, I don't remember if there's 2 or 3, including the one that just died, that I'm not going to talk about because that's already contemporary. That's a very short, just a few examples of a much longer and broader topic of the popes and Jewish history. This was Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.